Trish, welcome to the Ivy Podcast. I am so excited to have you here and dive deeper into your journey into being an experienced creator, what you're doing with On Deck, and talk a little bit more about the future of work and education. So, welcome to the
Hey,
show.
thanks, Cesar. Excited to be here. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. And to kick us off, I wanted to bring up something that I saw on your LinkedIn profile that it really got my attention. And I'm gonna read it verbatim. I live life as a series of one-way flights and two-way conversations. I spend my time and money on creating incredible experiences because the impact of people and places has proven to be much more valuable than things. Let's talk about that. Where did that come about?
Oh man, that has come about as me, I think, trying to kind of summarize like my lifestyle and kind of like I guess philosophy more or less on lifestyle over the past few years. So I I actually grew up in Middle America, and there was not a whole lot of diversity of things that I saw in my first 17 years of life. And so in some ways I felt like I'm kind of making up for lost time, you know, like, oh my gosh, there's so much left to see and so many people to meet. And so I've always been like, since the first time I went backpacking in Europe, I've been big on like backpacking and traveling. And that's really evolved throughout my life. But for the past 6 years or so, I have been living no home base. So everything I own fits in a backpack, and it's basically one-way flights on to the next destination. Although to be fair, since the pandemic, it's been more like one-way driving because I've been in Portugal for the last like year and some change now since the pandemic time. But still the same spirit for sure. So that's the one-way flights, and then the two-way conversations has just been something that I've noticed. Like the beauty of the one-way flights for me has been being able to speak with so many different types of people. And I feel like this spectrum of life where I would have been like, here's one end of the spectrum and here's the other, has been like stretched over and over again from just kind of like these different conversations that I've had with a ton of different people around the world, and very different settings and very different backgrounds than my own. So I've always just kind of felt this like beauty in like one-way flights, two-way conversations, do it again. And that's become kind of like the rhythm of my life for the last few years. And yeah, and of course, that's kind of like led me to this life where I have very few things, but I have very many places and very many people that I hold dear to my heart. So that's the core of it. Yeah.
I love it. I love it, and especially because you and I can relate. I used to work in the travel industry, and essentially we would put together these experiences for young people, and just seeing the conversations and the connections that would happen through that experience. That was the one of the most rewarding times in my career, just being that experienced designer creator. So yeah, definitely. I when I saw that on your LinkedIn profile, I was like, yeah, we definitely need to start with this because this is important, right? And I believe that experiences over anything else, because that's ultimately right when you die, you're not gonna take anything with you. You know, only the moments
Exactly.
that you created with the people that matter to you. Now,
Yeah.
so for those in the audience that might not be familiar with On Deck, tell us a bit more about. Well, first, tell us a bit more about your role at On Deck, right? What falls under your responsibilities, and what is the big problem that On Deck is looking to tackle?
Yeah, great, meaty question to kick things off here. So, On Deck is we see ourselves as the place that top talent goes to figure out what's next, build their ideas, or accelerate the path that they're on. And we have a bunch of different programs and fellowships that create different types of communities and really an overall ecosystem, as well as like content and a journey for people to do that, whether it is a position that they're in as a designer or the founder of a company company, an investor, interested in building in a certain sector like climate tech. So we have a lot of different flavors going on, but that's the gist of it. And I am our head of experience. So I really focus in on all things customer experience. So at the core of that, I think the experience function is really responsible for deeply understanding our customers, their needs, and whether our platform is helping them get there. And in what cases we are, like how we can build on that, and where we're falling short, like how we can improve that. And then ultimately just continue to understand our customers to continue to build new things that they're going to need in the next step of their journey. So that manifests in a ton of different ways. Like, you know, we have people and days on the team where we're all deeply in spreadsheets. We have moments where we're just out there talking to everybody in the community, and moments where, you know, we're doing like very baseline kind of like understanding and mapping of like how
Mhm.
people connect in the community. And then other days where we're much more strategic and trying to figure out like, okay, if this is the customer need and this is what's happening in the community, like what's the program structure or business model that like supports that in a sustainable way. So it manifests in a lot of different ways, but I think like core to everything I think about and do is like, why are people coming to On Deck, and like, are we helping them get there?
I love it. And well, with that, that's a perfect segue to why. What are some of the patterns that you are noticing when people come to On Deck? Right? What are some of the pain points that they bring? Some of the challenges, some of the roadblocks that they're experiencing.
Oof, great question. I think one of the meta roadblocks that we see from people, that we see in general, is like, so for people who are trying to figure out what's next, right? Like we have so many transition points in our adult lives now. And for people who are in one of those points saying like, hey, I've had this idea for a long time and this is gonna be my next company, and like trying to kind of like navigate when to leave your job and jump into that, or what those different paths will look like. It's really hard to attract other people who are on that same journey in that same moment, because I mean, just to put it honestly, like we don't all post on our LinkedIn and our Twitter saying, hello world, I'm at a little bit of an impasse in life, a little confused about where I'm going next. Anybody else like here, right? Like it's just not the kind of thing that we put out there. So being able to actually like find people on the journey that you're on in the right moment in time to kind of journey together, I think is inherently kind of difficult, and like should be easier, and is so core to like people kind of accelerating and growing and building what they want. So that's kind of one like meta need that we see in a lot of different flavors. um, Another thing that I've seen is like it can also just be a lonely journey in whatever anybody's doing, you know? So whether you are a designer, like, you know, we see designers who are the only designer in their company, and we see designers who have thousands of designers in their company, and in different ways and sometimes similar ways, those can be lonely places to be. And it can be hard to know like, hey, what's the next step in my career? Like, how do I learn these skills to like go from an individual contributor to a design manager? Like a lot of these things are unclear, right? Like we have K through 12 education, university, and then it's like good luck out there being an adult, and there's not a ton of structure around that. So I think we just see a lot of that, of kind of like looking for like resources and content and information and education, but also like really just looking to like connect with other people on that journey, or a little bit behind or a little bit in front, and figuring out kind of how to put all those different perspectives together into like figuring out where you're going as an individual.
I love that, and I love the emphasis on community. And I want to shift gears to that. Like, you know, why community is the future of work and education in your own words.
Yeah, I mean, I know community is the ultimate buzzword these days,
It is.
and yeah. So maybe I'll start by saying like my definition of community is really about like connections between people. I think that's what I'll use community as, at least for purposes of this conversation. Um, and I think a couple of things. So like when we think about the future of work and education, okay, I'm not arguing the fact that if you want to learn algebra, it's like someone should teach you algebra, and that's probably the best way to go about it. But I think as we move into like all these different stages of life and all these different careers and paths, and we're outside of kind of the traditional educational system, there's less of a like, here, you can objectively learn the information for like how to do algebra. And it's much more of like, there are many paths. They come with different pros and cons, like weigh the pros and cons, decide what matters most to you, prioritize, like did it. Like there's all these frameworks for how to do it. And ultimately, like those frameworks are extremely helpful, but they're blank. And so I see community as this amazing way of like, if you can start to fill in those frameworks with like stories and perspectives as others, like that's ultimately how you will find what relates to you, right? Like I didn't invent community. I didn't invent traveling. I didn't invent two-way conversations. I didn't invent any of that. I just met some people along the way and they were doing it. And I was like, ooh, that part resonates with me. I'm going to do that. Right. So I think that's where like so much of kind of like education comes from, and in kind of these like later stages of education in a more broad sense. And I think also like in the future of work, you know, there's a lot of theories on what that's going to look like, but ultimately like so much of work is becoming more and more human centered. Like the jobs we're all doing usually involve connecting with other people, and so finding ways to kind of build community into that, again, it fills in the frameworks with color is kind of my big belief around it. So I think the frameworks are important, but I think the community is equally as important, and when we put those together, that's kind of like the foundation for how we all learn and grow and prosper together.
I love that. I'm a big believer in the power of community, and I've been a believer since before it became trending, right? Before it was cool, because I just love to share whatever journey I'm on with other people. It just makes the experience richer, and
Yeah.
you also get to learn from your peers, right? Like what are they struggling with, or maybe you can help them out with, you might be slightly one level up. Yeah, just so many benefits to being part of community. And I stumbled upon this article today on Harvard Business Review about the gap between the education system and the gap between employers and employees. And it got me thinking about what Antek is doing. And I wanted to get your thoughts on that. Why do you think there's such a gap between what companies need versus the skills that you're supposedly going to develop by going to college, but you come out of college and you're like, okay, what do I do now? So I wanted to get your thoughts on that. How does Untech um, see it at like part of their vision to tackle this gap, or to bridge this gap?
Yeah, it's a great question. It's a really good question. And I think there's a lot of people trying to figure it out that have, and probably a lot of people that have stronger and better perspectives. But one thing that I've noticed, especially if you look at like all of us in tech, is that tech moves really quickly, like in a micro level and a macro level, like it moves quickly, things evolve quickly. It's like that's part of the appeal from my perspective. And I think many others, it's just exciting, you know, it's just innovative. Universities, on the other hand, are not really known for moving super quickly. Like their models are heavy historical, heavy legacy, and that's not a bad thing. But I think in some ways maybe, but I think that's a lot of where the gap starts to build. Is you have these like different roles and jobs and just tech in general evolving so quickly, and you have a universities evolving very slowly. So for a university to put together like an entirely new like degree or all these different things, it's like, well, tech has already produced all these different degrees. And that's why you see like, you know, some of the on deck programs we have community builders and founders and, you know, people in customer success, people in product management. Like you think of all of these roles where if you're in tech, you're like, oh yeah, I know tons of people that are in these different areas, right? But it would seem like it still seems right now, I actually just noticed this from saying it out loud, which it seems completely like it's actually really weird that there's nothing related at all. It's like you can't get a degree that sets you up to be a community builder. Like, you know, my degree is in economics. In some ways, that's great because I kind of feel like the best parts of economics are like a social experiment. And like kind of a lot of my job now is like a social experiment in a non-creepy way. But ultimately, right, like these roles are entirely different from these kind of like degrees that you can earn. And so I think what we've started to see and what I've seen even in my lifetime is like you get a degree as this thing of like, okay, I did it, I credentialed myself with a university degree, right? And then the next step is like, now what am I going to do? It's not like, oh, I got a degree so I can do this thing. It's very different. And so I think it makes a lot of sense that like in these new roles, people are like, what is the skill set that you need to have as someone in customer success to move from here to here? Because it's completely unclear, and it's an entirely new industry, right? So like that's unclear to people in universities. That's also unclear to like employers, right? Like, and someone, you know, with my background working in customer experience or community or experience, like however you want to phrase it, there's no career path for that. They're like, I've never known, hey, this will be my next title, you know? So many of my friends have joked with me, like, did you know that like head of experience is not a real title? And I'm kind of like, well, I've had it at a few different places now, so it seems kind of real. But yeah, all of that to say, like, there's just a huge gap there, and it's because of how quickly things are evolving, which is exciting. So I think one of the ways that like On Deck is starting to really fill that gap is we are bringing these people together, like all the top community builders in the world right now, the top customer success people in the world right now. Like, let's come together and like get clarity and learn from each other and up level and hear from the top people in the industry. But let's also write the narrative for the industry, because these are new, and like the narrative is out there to be written.
I love that. And I always think about, look, I went to college, got a business degree. I love my teachers, but none of my teachers had real world experience in the thing that they were teaching, whether it was business, economics, finance. And I see On Deck, and there's other companies out there that are disrupting that because they're bringing together experts, professionals in the field that are practicing what they're teaching and helping students develop or sharpen that skill set that is going to make them more marketable, right?
Mhm.
So yeah, I always thought about that, like my teacher doesn't really practice this. They know this by theory,
Yeah.
but they don't really practice it, right? So that it's hard to relate to your teacher, right? If it's someone that it's not practicing what they're teaching, right? So I think On Deck, it's doing great on that front.
Yeah, and actually building on that super quickly, we so like it's also something interesting because I don't think like anyone on the On Deck team is necessarily like a teacher or a professor, right? So like
Mm-hmm.
in some ways we mirror kind of like an educational institution of
Mm-hmm.
sort, but you like we don't have professors per se. But what we are starting to build out is we have a head of education on the team who's starting to kind of build out different modules. And the
Mm-hmm.
way that those are being built is basically finding the best subject matter experts who are normally full-time employed doing what they do best,
Yeah.
and giving them a megaphone to like tell everybody else, hey, this is what I'm doing to make this happen. So we
Mm-hmm.
actually have a few of those in production right now. But I think that fits so perfectly with what you said, is like, yeah, we've been talking a lot around this idea of like, find the people who have been doing this the longest, do it the best, have the
Mm-hmm.
best insights around it, and give them a megaphone. And that's like the content and information that people are looking for.
Yeah, absolutely. And let's say I'm someone that is looking to pivot because I've been in a career path and I no longer want to be doing that. How do I figure it out what skill sets to develop, right? What would you recommend to this person? Should I join on Deck to figure it out, or should I figure it out first? Talk to a few people. Yeah, what we recommend to someone that's looking to pivot, but they're not really sure. Like, hey, what skill sets should I develop?
Yeah. I think that's it's a hard thing to know. And I'm imagining the person you're describing in this, which has been me at points in my life, right? Because
Me too.
I worked in consulting for a few years, which is quite different than what I do now. When I think back to myself in that position, I was missing two things. Like, one thing is I was missing any type of framework or information on how to even think through that. I was just kind of like, ooh, I don't really feel like I'm going to be building financial models in Excel like this and like selling deals to these people for the rest of my life, kind of thing, but I didn't have a way of thinking about it at all. And the other part was like kind of going back to what we were saying about community, is I didn't know anybody, like everybody else who I knew was like, in the same point as me, but thinking of themselves as like, how do I become partner at this consulting firm? Not like, how do I get out of the consulting firm, right? So I think that is like broadly what I would say is like having a framework for how to think about it, or a couple, and having other people kind of around you who are on that journey is core. And we actually have a fellowship at On Deck we call it On Deck First 50. And it's
Yeah.
for people thinking about becoming like the first 50 employees. And our program director, Anthony, for that program has actually been working with people for ages to help them find their next career. And so he brings in experts and a ton of kind of like those frameworks and content that you need for thinking through that. But then you also have that community element where everybody else in your cohort is also trying to figure out what's next, right? And so like putting those two together, I think that's where the magic happens. And like these ones are also tricky because I never feel like you end up being like, you know what? Actually, this is a question that I want to ask everybody in the audience because I'm always curious about this. Because people tell stories all the time that I've heard where they're like, and then I realized like this was the perfect role for me, and I landed upon it. And people have these like aha moments. I, for one, have never had one. I've kind of been like, oh, this has worked out nicely. I'm going to do more of this and less of that kind of thing. So I don't know if we can ever promise like you get that to that aha moment, but I do think you can get like clarity on the next step.
Definitely getting clarity on the next step. Because when you jump into a journey with a community, right, it's just gonna make the journey easier. And from experience, I have fallen into roles. Like it's interesting how it happens because I just start in my journal, put something. Hey, I want to design experiences, right? And I landed an opportunity at a travel startup over 8 years ago, and that took me down this path that I had no idea, right? But I just had some clarity and some vision. And then even with this podcast, I set the intention out there into the universe. Hey, I want to practice being a podcast host. And then the universe conspired. It's just it's crazy how things work at times. But it's all about putting the intention out there, getting some clarity, finding the community, and just venture into the unknown, right?
Yeah, for sure, for sure. And that's actually like a lot of what, I mean, in many ways, that is how I ended up working at On Deck. And also like I think in many ways is very similar to kind of like what actually drew me into On Deck, because I saw like the first kind of customers were all people who were in this like uniquely open-minded stage of that, of kind of like putting it out there, seeing what comes back. And yeah, you know, I don't think it's possible to spend our entire lives kind of like fully opening or fully pivoting. You kind of got to go through the ebbs and flows of it. But being able to catch people who are ebbing and flowing at the same time is like core to magic I've seen in many communities, and definitely On Deck.
I love it. And to wrap up our education and community segment, what are some of the innovations that you are excited about in the education field? You know, or some of the things that you are researching and excited about what's coming?
Yeah, I mean, I don't have any type of formal background in education, so I'm kind of like constantly learning about like the true frameworks there. And so when I speak about education, I speak about it in the broadest sense of the word.
Yeah.
Um, One of the things that I'm most excited about at the moment is the idea of aligning action with like what in education I think is broadly called
Mm.
learning outcomes. So a
Hmm.
lot of times, you know, like if you think back to like the K through 12 experience, it's like learn this thing and then take the test to prove that you learned that thing. And that makes sense in a lot of senses. But I love the idea of like build the thing. And the fact that you built the thing shows that you like learned how to build the thing. And so I think like that's how I've learned a lot of stuff. And yeah, I'm just really inspired and like excited by that type of thinking. So that's my number one right now. It's like it's like action oriented learning kind of idea, or like output oriented learning, or whatever it will come to be called. But yeah, that's my number one at the moment.
Awesome. Yeah, and I see that all the time, especially if you go to Twitter, you know, hashtag build in public, where you get to put into practice essentially what you learn, right? Which is, I think it's the best way to learn by having a project, whether it's paid or unpaid. sometimes people get stuck in like, oh, I'm not getting paid for this. Yeah, but you might be building experience, right, with whatever project you're working on. So definitely encourage anyone out there to start building something.
Yeah, exactly, exactly. We are big on build in public at On Deck. We have a couple of folks on the team who are like the early prophets of build in public, and it's hard, right? Because when you start trying to do it, you're like, I remember when I first started writing and like publishing writing, I would just like read it and read it and read it so many times before I finally hit publish. It was like this weird compulsion, but the more I hit publish, the more it was easy to hit publish, right? And I think that's how all these things go, and that's like the power behind build in public. So yeah, let's all build in public, people. It's great.
Let's do it. Now, Trish, to shift gears here, I want to talk about leadership because I definitely see you as someone that has a leadership position, inspires lots of people, and I wanted to dive into that. How has being a leader changed your thinking about work and life? Right? You've held role right now at On Deck, but at Unreasonable and Remote here, you've held these leadership positions that uh, shaped right your thinking, and I wanted to ask you about that.
Oh yeah, remote year was the first time that I led a really large team. I think at the largest we probably had about like 50 people on the team, and we were fully remote, and they were all around the world, and it was like and moving all the time as well. And so that was like a hugely transformative experience for me. And I mean, one thing that I've been really fortunate with is I feel like I've always led teams where most people on the team are just like a lot smarter than me. So I think I've had maybe, I don't know if that's unique or not to others' experience, but that's been something that's like reshaped my thinking a ton, because I think like the kind of traditional thinking many times, and especially coming from like, out of university, I went into consulting, for example, and it's very much like, like a boss or a manager or the top person on the team or the team lead tells you their ideas and then you execute them kind of thing, and it goes in these orders. And so I think there's a lot of that type of thinking in the world where it's easy to become a team lead and have the kind of default thought of like, okay, I need to make sure everybody on the team knows my ideas and perspectives on this. But what I learned super quickly is like, that's just actually like quite the opposite. Like the job of a team lead is like, I need to make sure everybody's clear on like the goals, where we're headed, and any guardrails that like they should be aware of. And then I need to listen to them, to their ideas and perspectives, and make sure they get everything they need to get there. And that's what I'm doing. And like it's really different. And I know there's tons of these kind of books out there now of like Leaders Eat Last and all of that kind of stuff. But I find it's just like, yeah, a lot of times when I talk to like first time managers, I kind of tell people like whatever you have learned from like, especially if you come from these like consulting or banking kind of backgrounds, just do the like make that like line in your mind, like make it do an inverse 180 that line and then follow that line, and then you're on the right track. So yeah, it's been hugely transformative for me, and also just reminded me of like, like we are all humans at the core of it. So obviously like we all go do jobs. Some like I don't know if all of us would go do our jobs in the same way if it wasn't paid, for example. And there's a lot of reasons why we do our jobs. But also like we do a job for some of those foundational reasons. We like give it our all and care about a job because of like the team, the environment, what we're building, the impact that we can have. And so to me, it's like the best way to like get that out of a person is understand as a leader, like what drives this person and like where does that align with what this company is trying to build. And if you get that right, like my finding has been most things just kind of fall into place in a magical way after that.
Yeah, I have learned that leadership is all about service. You are serving your team, you're serving others, and that's what you said, right? Aligning on the priorities, on the goals, and then making sure that they have everything they need to meet those goals. So, um, what about any challenges, or I guess what's your favorite failure of yours? One that taught you the most, and a lesson that you still carry with you to this day.
I think that this relates both to kind of like the community like aspect of things, but also the leadership aspect of things. Because as kind of like a community manager or like an experienced designer or the person who gets to see all the data of everything that comes in from everybody, right? And similarly on the team, as a team lead, you're kind of the person with the most context, you have the most visibility. And so I think in those situations, it's like this tricky balance of two things, and one of those is just like listening well, like listen to the community, listen to the team, understand what they need, respond kind of thing. And then on the other side of that, there's like the famous Henry Ford quote, which is something about like, if I would have given people what they wanted, we would have fast horses instead of cars, right?
Yeah.
And so there's also a little bit of that because it's like you have the most context, like you should be the one to see the car instead of the fast horse kind of thing. And so I think some of my like all of my my moments that I'm just like, oh, Trish, come on, that was terrible. They all go back to either being like super reactive to what people were saying, either in a
Mm.
community or in a team, or being like super Henry Fordish, being like, but these are cars, and everyone's just like, we don't need cars, kind of thing, right? And so I think like balancing those would be the number one for me. And I'd say like maybe one more kind of like very specific example in there as well is there have been like, so yeah, a few specific examples are coming to mind. So I think one is on the side of like communities, it's really easy to go into Henry Ford mode. Okay,
Mhm.
everybody, this is what we're rolling out. And I remember at remote year, we heard from a lot of people who were traveling in the communities. They were like, I want to get more kind of like direct interaction with the local communities. I feel like I'm in this community of travelers, but not really like interacting with the communities we're living in, right? And
Mhm.
so I immediately was like, we're going to have local tracks. It's a 5-part series. You're going to do all these different events within and we're hiring a local team to set it up for you. And it was an amazing idea. But when we put it out there, people were like, okay. And then like it quickly evolved, right? Like it was no longer this 5-set series. It was like very flexible. People could opt into stuff. It was very different than the original vision. And it like, I could have figured that out from just talking to customers about the idea instead of like launching it, right? So that's like one example of way too Henry Ford. And I think one example of like listening too much or like being too reactive to kind of exactly what we hear is I kind of have the natural compulsion of like I want people to feel excited about what they're doing. And so sometimes I will respond to someone in a way that's like, get excited instead of like, here's how it fits into the big picture, which is hopefully exciting. And so that's another thing I kind of work on as like a tiny habit in my day is like, don't just react to the situation. It's actually okay to have moments where like a customer is not happy or an employee's not on a good path that they're happy with. Like you can sometimes sit with that and find a better answer if you give it a minute instead of like reacting super quickly. So yeah, those are some just a few of the many options to share here.
I definitely relate to them. I've been on that side of giving what I think the community wants, but it turns out that that's not what they want. And yeah, listening is a tricky one, right? Because sometimes people they don't know what they want, but they tell you things, and it's your job to figure it out. So I definitely relate to
That's
it.
good. That's good. I'm glad I'm not alone in it. You
No,
never
you're
know.
not. You're not alone, especially if you work with communities. It's
Yeah. Yeah.
it's
Everyone's had this moment.
yeah. Now, Trish, there's a lot of women that listen to the podcast, and I want to ask you, what advice would you have for them if they're looking to step into a leadership role, but they might not be sure how to go about it, or they might have like imposter syndrome. What advice would you have for them?
Yeah, that's a great question. One of the things I hear a lot from like up and coming women leaders that I speak with is that feeling of like, I look around this room and I feel like I don't belong here. And so the way I always respond to that is like, the reason you're in the room is because you belong in the room. That's it. So like you belong in the room. Like that's just the foundational information. And then like the question I always pose is like, what if your question was actually like, what should I do in this room? Like what's the best thing to do in the room? And that I think is like my best advice, or kind of reframe of like, it's really easy to look around and be like, like, why am I here? Maybe I'm not good enough, or I don't have enough experience, or
Hmm.
I don't have any of those things. But the thing is, like, a lot of people feel that way, right? Like I feel
Hmm.
that way oftentimes. And I think it's like there's two paths forward. One is to like convince yourself that that's true. Like, oh no, I'm not good enough to be here. And two is to be like, what would it look like for someone to be great in the role I'm
Mm,
in right now? Okay, I guess I'll do that kind of thing. And so I
love it.
think it can be really easy to get stuck, not have people to talk to, not have people that you feel like are on the same
Hmm.
page, look around the room, not see anybody that you feel like is similar to you in a
Hmm.
bunch of different ways. But my best advice is like, know that you are where you are for good reason, and take advantage of it and build on it. And I'm about to. I'm feeling a cuss word coming out, which I don't think is appropriate. So I'm gonna push it back down. But basically, like take like when you see an opportunity where you're wondering if you belong or not, or if you're good enough or not, like you're good enough, and now show everybody else in the room that that's the case, and do something awesome.
I love it. I love it. And what about if you want to be in the room, but you're not in the room yet? How do you get to the room?
Yeah, that's another great question. And this is a different journey for everybody.
Yeah.
And to be like completely honest about it, I think it's like there's a lot of luck and timing
Hmm.
involved with like skill and a lot of other things. And the rooms often only have a few people. And so
Yeah.
it often comes down to a few personalities as well. But I think like one of the things that has helped me most in kind of my career is like asking a lot of questions, listening a lot, trying to get as much context as possible, because I often find that environments where like somebody is like getting something wrong, so to speak, like, kind of
Hmm.
taking something the wrong direction, it's usually just a lack of context. That's it. There's like some information
Right.
that everybody else is thinking that they don't have. And so they would probably reorient a bit if they had that information. That
Hmm.
happens a lot. And so that can be really easy when you're growing in your career, because you aren't always looped into all the context. So I
Hmm.
think you have to be incredibly proactive about getting the right information. And like the best way to do that is like, the classic advice of like build relationships. But I think it's ask questions. Like there's been like really young people who have joined recent teams I've been on, and I see people being like, so what's your biggest challenge right now? What do you think is like the biggest thing that someone in my role could add to the company? Like
Hmm.
questions like that. I'm like, oh my God, these people are going to be president. That's it. Like they like, yeah, like, and I know that I'm not the only one they're asking, right? Like they asked a bunch of people in the
Yeah.
company, and I'm just like, well, yes, it's just a genius idea. So I think like asking those questions so that you get that context will then kind of show, like, it's a great way to show of like, hey, listen, like, here I
Hmm.
am. I got all this great stuff. Like, let's go. Put me in the
And
room because the room needs me.
I love it. And asking questions is also part of being a great leader, right? Like you all always asking questions. So asking questions, know your worth, know that if you're in the room, it's because you deserve to be there. Be confident. Love it. Um, Trish, this has been awesome. And to wrap it up, I always like to ask my guests about books. So, what is one of your favorite books, or the one book that you have gifted the most and that has had a profound influence in your career or in your personal life that we can plug into the show?
Great question. Uh, the one that I've gifted the most is called The Happiness Hypothesis by
Hmm.
Jonathan Haidt. And it has some really interesting stuff in it, just around it's like very related to a bunch of the work I did for a while in behavioral economics, and just kind of understanding like why we do what we do, why we think how we think. And it was one of the most influential things I read, and just like honestly giving me a bit of like self-awareness and understanding on stuff, to know like, oh, this literally happens to all humans, and this is how you can like play it up or minimize it or whatever. So it's just like a nice little toolkit for like understanding happiness, which I feel like is at the core to all of us and everything that we're doing. Like we all do everything better when we're happy. So let's get some tools for that for sure.
I love it. And that's the ultimate goal, right? Happiness. Because if you're not happy, then you really need to reconsider or reevaluate your priority, or what you're doing, right? So I'm so happy that you brought that up. I'll definitely get that book and include it in the show notes as well. But uh,
Amazing.
but Trish, this has been awesome. Thank you so much for coming on the show, sharing your experience uh, with our audience, with On Deck, what you're doing with On Deck, and the big vision to continue disrupting the future of working education. And I'm personally looking forward to having you on future episodes to catch up and continue this conversation. But for now, just want to say thank you. And yeah, it's been a pleasure.
Amazing. Well, thanks for having me. This was tons of fun and excited to continue the conversation.
Absolutely.